My name is Eddie Herrman. The acceptance of my first video, Butler, 1852 to 1920, has been gratifying. So I have done a modern version. Now, it would be nice to have total recall and a perfect memory, but I don't. So if I've missed someone or something, or got a date or an address mixed up, just bear with me. Now, there is this warning. You should be advised that this video is quite a bit longer than the first one. You might want to watch it in segments. So ready or not, as Paul Harvey would say, here's the rest of the story. Butler, the continuing saga, 1920s to the year 2000. Shown on your screen is a Chamber of Commerce brochure of the 1950s with the Butler High School band marching around the square. In the mid-40s, the city of Butler, hereafter known as the city, bought property north of town on US 71 from Grover Gilbert for $16,000 to build an airport. Jim Hatfield and Rudy Reeves built the first two buildings, and in 1947, Frank Goodson of Texas opened a flying service and school as shown in this photo, courtesy of Lorraine McClary. In the early 1950s, George Christopher, a farmer west of Passaic, was elected U.S. representative for this district. He used the airport quite a bit. Here he is returning from Washington, D.C., and some friends have gathered to meet him. Shown left to right are the Ray Lockharts, the Andy Cummingses, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher and son Tom, the Roy Hendricksons, the Stan Shaws, the W.O. Jacksons, and Roger Cummings. This is the airport today. In 1958, Robertson's Aviation opened here, and the VFW Post bought the main building, which originally was the Airport Inn restaurant and later the Black Angus restaurant. In 1977, Tom and Mary Spencer moved their aircraft maintenance company from Grain Valley to this location. In 1999, to celebrate his 85th birthday, Butler businessman Melvin Ingram made a parachute jump at the airport. He's shown with his instructor above him. Organized in the late 1930s, the Osage Valley Electric Co-op had its first office on the east side of the square. In 1961, they moved to this new building south of the airport. Gary and Trevelyan Schoengert in 1990 built this fine funeral chapel. The first funeral was for Harold Lee Fritz. The Masonic Lodge moved from the third floor of the Inn building on the square to this new building on North 71. The special lens plant was built in 1948, closing in 1979. The building was revamped and reconstructed for Richard Vaughn's lumber yard. Later, the present owner, John Galladay, renamed it Midwest Lumber and Supply Company. In the former Coca-Cola bottling location, the blue building on the left, is a truck and tractor repair shop. The tan building on the right is a dusty attic antique store. It was once OK Rubber Welders, a recapping outfit managed by Jim Olive, and then Pioneer Family Supply with Wes Jensen and Barbie DeLozier were there. In the late 50s, the east side of US 71 North was being developed. Besides the lens plant, there was Bailey's Cafe, and to the south, next door, was Mowdy's service station that became Levon Berkebile's Paralyn station. On the right hand of the curve ahead, the MFA Oil Company used to have a station. Operators were the Fleischmans and later Charles E. Smith and J.D. Krupp. Now it's Don Gear Real Estate. In the background is the Hyman Agriculture Services. Northwest of the Butler Light Plant is the Donald Gear Sales Pavilion. Gear's father-in-law, Jack Sivils, bought the land in 1951. Sivils had been involved in auctioneering and sales barns since 1940. Gear is now assisted by his son, Jace. The first light plant for Butler was at Pine and Lion Streets back in 1883. Now Butler has one of the most efficient plants in a town for its size, and was the first town west of the Mississippi River to generate its own electricity, hence the logo, the Electric City. Now in 1934, Butler was having water problems, so they drilled 2 wells near the light plant. Finally, after drilling nearly 2 months down past the 1,000-foot mark, they had one that was plentiful but salty. The other didn't gush, but tasted better. So a couple of years later, they paid a man to come from Prescott, Kansas, who was a master driller, for advice, and he said, fill in the bad one and use the good one. Boy, that was easy money, wasn't it? About a quarter of a mile west of the light plant is the Herman Schubert Farm. In the 1920s and 30s, Charter Oak Farm was a mecca for buyers of quality hogs. Organized in 1982, the Elks Lodge built their new building northwest of the light plant on Pine Tree Road. In the 1980s, the Ward Box plant that services Russell Stover Candies as well as other businesses was built in Butler's Industrial Park on Pine Tree Road. Built the same time and place, Russell Stover ships candy to several points, and the sales store is a stopping place for tour buses. Back south in West Butler, we have part of the Herman Agri Service located on both sides of Pine Street at the railroad. The basic plant was built by Marion Arnold in 1958 and bought by Jim and Cornelius Hyman of Rockville, Missouri, who has greatly expanded the business. When the railroads quit passenger service on the line through Butler, the need for a depot was nil. This was torn down several years ago, and it's too bad it couldn't have been preserved as a museum. A grain elevator for many years at the railroad on Ohio Street, Bill and Lynn Kinney bought it and then later sold to the Butler Grain Company and Tiona Truck Line. In 1975, this elevator burnt to the ground. The former elevator grounds are now used exclusively by the Tiona Truck Line owned by Frosty Tiona. Across the highway from the light plant in the 50s and 60s was once the Argenbright Farm, then the Gilbert Farm, and it was showing commercial growth. And this location was now the Cammer Truck and Car Washes to the left, and the Laughlin Machinery to the right, which at one time was a cafe. Then it was Randy's Drive-In, Bud Martin's TV Center, and Jeff West Used Cars. North of the previous photo was Butler Ford Tractor and later Lester Baker's B&L Glass, and that's now Butler Glass Company. On the southeast corner of Mill and Business 71 for a while, the only business was the Tour Rest Court built in 1947 by Hugh Sanders. The only flaw was that when it was completed, he had to sue the city to get water and sewer to his property, even though they had earlier promised it. In this aerial photography, you can see the empty expanses around it, and at the upper left is what is thought to be the first of Bolwig's electric shop. On the right side, the building with the 4 vehicles around it was Donald Pearson's Cream-Made Drive-In, Butler's first. This color photo shows the Tour Rest at a later date. Claude Rayburn had purchased it, and Harley Page had a branch real estate office there. And the Cream-Made Drive-In at the extreme right was operated by Margie Cox. This complex is now rental storage units. In 1959, Mr. Pearson, who had opened the Poplar Cream-Made, built a Champlin station on this corner. Later, Bill Blankenship operated the station. And then it became Keegan's Barbecue and later Joe Fuller's Restaurant, and now is run by the Foote families on the left. The large building in the middle was built for the ASCS office, who has since moved and is now owned by Butler Bates County Health Center and occupied by the Senior Citizen Center. To the right is a building built and occupied for a while by the A&P Grocery Store, and now the Bates County Health Center owns it and occupies it. Across Business 71 on the southwest corner of Mill and 71 is Cox's Feed Store. In 1952, it was originally Pioneer Dairy, operated by Henry Whalen and Hewlett Wheatley, and bought later by Clifford Clark. To the south end was Jim Gardner's Lawn Boy Mower Shop. Danny Cox has expanded to the south, including the former Hubbard's Market Building. Just south of the Cox Building in 1972, Stan and Virginia Elliott opened a used car lot. It was closed in the 80s. South of Elliott's, a service station opened, operated by Herman Casey, later by Red Huff and others, and at one time as a mower repair shop and part of Hubbard Market. Just north of Con Transportation, Harry Crummett opened the Dairy Queen Drive-In, Butler's second. Later owners and operators were Elise Doan and Fern Raines, then Myrna and Bill Kraft, and later it was Korean Garden, and now it's being remodeled for future occupancy. Kahn Transportation originated at 107 West Ohio up near the square. Lester Kahn moved it to the highway. Now son Ronnie is in charge. The Sonic Drive-In is across the street from Kahn Transportation and was built by Marion Leneve. Before the Sonic in this location was a New Show movie house built in 1947. For a while it played second fiddle to Fisk Theater on the square until the burning of Fisk Theater. Skyview Drive-In Theater on South 71 later finished the New Show off, and it became the Butler Bowling Alley, and the first manager was Paul Scott. Here is the April 1955 show calendar for the New Show. In the 1950s, C.R. James opened a roller rink at 615 West Adams, and is still being operated by another owner. In 1960, Ross and Arleta Daniel bought Elmer Sutton's Plumbing and opened on the south side of the square. Later, they built this building west of their residence, east of the roller rink. Their sons now occupy the shop. Just south of the roller rink, Wilbur Haston opened Haston Motors. Later it was Bill Stump Motors, and then Dwayne Hall Motors, and then it was burnt in 1953. Wilbur reopened as Haston Glass and sold to Lester Baker, who opened B&L Glass. When Haston first opened his business, he had this wrecker, and some of those shown here is the second from the left is Haston himself, and next to him is Eula Gear, and then seated is Harley Page, and above the N in Haston is Laverne Hanna. Bud Welborn bought this building from Wilbur Haston and has a large veterinary business here. The movie market on the far left was formerly Fred Riddle Auto Parts, later O'Reilly's first location. This Casey's was the third location in Butler, number 2 near the square, and the first one was across the corner southwest from this location, north of Sergeant's Cafe. Earlier there was Duke Rule's Dog and Suds, Bob Barron's Tasty Freeze, and the Mary Keys Cafe, and others before Casey's. Across the street, Harvey Overweather built the Butler Super Service back in 1927. Carl Stewart, his son-in-law, later operated it, and the bus station as well. Here's that last building to the extreme right, and then in front of it, to the south, is the Orange Street Saloon. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were a lot of places to eat in Butler, and nearly every service station had a cafe. But Frank and Nina's card said it all. Across on the west side of Orange Street, we find Sergeant's Car Lot and Restaurant. On the car lot was a service station for years. Bert Bradley had it first in the 30s, and Joe Dennis operated for several years, and later it was Casey's first location in Butler. The restaurant was originally Glenn Hutton's Lynn's Cafe, which along with Herman Schubert's MFA burned in 1959. This is on the corner of Ohio Street and US 71 in 1927. Forrest Hours at the tank truck opened this Sinclair station, and at the pumps is Fritz Hours. Later Hours added to the crew and to the station. Shown left to right is Harry Wells, Forrest Hours, Florence Hours, Alice Hours, Blanche Hours, Fritz Hours, and Lester Hours. The Hours Oil Company is now operated by Lester and Gerald Hours. And to the north is what used to be Lola's Cafe and Alice's Cafe, and is now the Cellular Telephone Sales on the left. Across the corner southwest of Hours is the D&D Tire Shop, operated by the Clyde Kisner family. It was the former location of Harry Cherry's Hudson service station. Just south where Everett Auto and Tractor Supply is was a service station operated in the 50s by Charles E. Smith Center, with attendant Arthur Bartley to his right. The locker plant to the south was operated by Roger Cummings, then Victor Hogue, and later Lamoury Williams of the Uptown Locker plant bought it and combined it with his business and closed this location. Behind or to the west of Everett Auto Supply is the Chris Sage Animal Health Clinic and Eldon Neely's Auto Repair. Sam Fuller at one time had a welding shop back there. Just south of Everett's Auto Supply was the Bill Delaplane's mobile station in the 30s, and Elmer Sherman opened the American Chick Hatchery in 1942. The past few years it's been used for storage. Back on Ohio Street, south of our station, is the My Car Wash, owned by Scott Richter. Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Myers built this and then sold to him just recently. In the center was Ross Simmons' APCO station for a few years, and then he sold to Don Malin, who has a total station. Shown on the right is Hardee's, Butler's first national food franchise, and was formerly several implement dealers and car dealers and the Osage Valley location. On the northwest corner of Business 71 and Fort Scott Street was first Burt Bradley Skelly Station, and left to right was Rome Alcar, J.K. Wirt, Bradley himself, and Marvin Compton. In 1953, Joe and Eula Gear opened the new Skelly Station on that corner. They are pictured with Marvin Compton right and Skelly official John Briggs on the left. Carl Martin now operates the Sinclair Station on the same corner. To the right, north of Carl Martin's, was the Highway Hamburger Shop. The blue building at the extreme right is the Everett Auto Supply. Just east of Hardee's, Wesley Jensen's real estate and insurance building is shown, and behind it the storage buildings owned by Jensen. This was previously Young's Machine Shop location. Originally built for the Federal Land Bank and the Warrensburg Production Credit Association, this building is occupied by the Bates County Mutual Insurance Company, one of Bates County's oldest continuously operating businesses. Just to show you how times have changed, in 1975, Charter Bank, the old Butler State Bank, built this drive-through walk-in bank at on Fort Scott Street. Through the years, it has been Boatman's, Nations, and August of '99 became Bank of America. Shirley Herman was manager from opening day to her retirement in 1997. The sign was replaced by a Bank of America sign a few days after this photo was taken. On the corner of Fort Scott and High Streets, Culver Underwood moved from North Main in 1960 into the former home of the Cloyd Dixon family that had been built by W.F. Duval, a financier. Johnny Underwood and Robert Steinbeck continued their funeral service traditions on this location. To better serve their clients, Underwood and Steinbeck added a large funeral parlor and some needed office space. In later days, Mr. Steinbeck passed away and his son Rob took over and now operates this business. In 1961, Art Headley Jr. opened a standard station at the southeast corner of Business 71 and Fort Scott Street. Other operators were Dale Wainscott, Linlow Colburn, and then it was purchased by the Clyde Kane family for a bakery and now managed by Dwight Kane, and it's widely known for their products. Across Orange Street from Kane's Bakery is O'Reilly's Auto Parts, built in 1952 for the McKeon Supermarket, and since then has been Charlie Wine's Market and the GW Market also, and now it's O'Reilly's. South of O'Reilly's is the Wilson Tire Company, used to be Alan Pyatt's, Alice Chalmers, and Wallace Farm Supply. Continuing south on Orange Street is the Stoplight Market, operated and owned by the Martin Smith family. At the left is the former Stevenson Liquor Store, now operated by Ruth Ann Grizel and called Grizel's Liquor, Tackle, and Gun Shop. West of O'Reilly's, this group of buildings has been King Arthur's Bargain Barn, the Hen House Poultry House, Rob's Finished Produce, Dwight Bittner's Furniture, Dean Scott's Furniture, Ken Shearer's Appliance, and Jerry Bishop Auto Parts. Now, Robert Sharon and Charlotte Miller, florists. On the right, Lynn Fuller's Radio Shack in the middle, and the Roby Truck Line office on the left, and Lawn Pro office operated by Jim Fonstock at extreme right. Left. Let's go west on Fort Scott, or 52, just past the railroad underpass. On the south side was the old Butler Country Club. The sign says, out-of-town players, green fees, 50 cents. In 1944, an Air Force P-38 plane crashed in this golf course, but the pilot walked away uninjured. This is how the old golf course looks today. Prominent along 52 Highway is the Community First Bank, organized in 1997 by former Boatman's officials Rusty Hamilton and Bruce Jessup. It was first built by Citizens Bank, and then later the Mercantile Bank took over, who sold it to these gentlemen. Behind the bank is a strip mall. One time, Foodtown had a large supermarket in the west half, but closed in '82, and Mattingly's, or Matco, was in the east half for a while. Shown is the dollar store and the Osage Pecan outlet, which was moved from north of the Inn building up in the square. On west, on the south side of 52 Highway, we find Walmart, Country Mart Supermarket, the Sears store owned by Larry Winburn, and McDonald's and Pizza Hut. If you can see their signs. New to West Butler are Mazzio's and Taco Bell at the Conoco convenience store, all on the left side going west. Shown at the left is the modern version of the Bates County National Bank. This and the Uptown Bank, plus the original Amoret Bank, are owned by Bill and Cheryl Gepford. The Days Inn Motel is shown to the right, and it opened in 1999. Shown east of the 4-lane 71 is Butler Motors, originally Bar Ford, and now is operated by Richard McLean. The Flaming Lantern Restaurant is owned and operated by Neil Steiner, was originally the West Oak Steakhouse owned by Bud Welburn. And at the extreme left is the Super 8 Motel. Across west over 71 is the popular Mexican restaurant Albertina's. Moving from Amsterdam, Albertina and husband Brock Mullis built this new building in the 1990s. George Ross moved the Vitazine plant from its location west of the square to this location west of 71, and is now operated by son Rusty and son-in-law Don Law. Also shown to the rear is Derailed Commodity Market and Bob and Glenn's Equipment, owned by Glenn Welsh. Backtracking to Rice Road, named after Melvin Rice, a civic leader in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, is the Windy Hill Pet Food Plant, and to the right, the MFA Agri Services. On south on Rice Road is an old business in Bates County, the Southside Lumber Company. They buy walnut logs, saw them, and sell them to have furniture made. Ebert Westover moved to the outskirts of Butler, and also had an implement company at one time. This company is now operated by Ivan Westover, a son. Back east under the railroad underpass, Nursery Street, for 45 years, Roy and Stella Baker ran a sale barn and cafe, and at one time had a few cabins too. Roy is holding a girl from the cabins by the cash register, and Mrs. Baker, Stella, is at the right. The others are also tenants of the cabins. Later it was a sugar shack, and then George Windish had a veterinarian service here. At the corner of Nursery and Business 71, we find the U.S. Department of Agricultural Service Center. This office moved from the location on Mill Street, where the senior citizens now meet. One of the older businesses in Butler and still operating is the Deems Farm Equipment. In the late 30s, John Deems and Howard Deerwester opened the Butler Tractor and Implement Company in the Henry Building on North Main, and later moved to West Ohio. And in '67, they moved to this area on South 71. Some information about the property where Deems, the agricultural office, and Thorco's located. In 1929, the Chamber of Commerce bought 80 acres owned by Lula Horn south of Butler for a flying field. And it became a flying field, but then was discontinued when they built a new one on North 71. In 1948, the Chamber of Commerce organized a stock company to build a building to be leased or sold to industry. Butler Industrial Development Corporation was organized and stock was issued. One of those stock certificates is shown. The Industrial Committee built this building and the Keller Ladder Company was secured to occupy it. After several years of ups and downs, they left. The corporation was then dissolved and the building sold to the Thorco Company of Lamar to build shelving for large stores such as Walmart and Kmart. Thorco has more than doubled the original size. South of Thorco is the T&T Fun Center bowling lanes, originally called the Tower Bowl because of its close proximity to the TV cable tower, and was built by Barney Zelmer. In earlier years, Claude Warren and Harry Cherry had filling stations in this area across the road from each other. In 1926, the Commercial Club, later to be known as the Chamber of Commerce, backed Mrs. S.C. Staton to open the first hospital in Butler at her home at 107 South Havana Street, south of the Uptown Casey's, and now owned by Mrs. Orville Jackson. In 1932, Mrs. Staton had this building built, and in 1941, room rates were $2.75 a day, operating room was $5.20, and x-rays were $5. In 1943, the city bought out Mrs. Staton for $20,000. In 1959, the city bought property south of Thomas Deaton Football Field for $15,000 for a new hospital. And in 1960, the new hospital was opened, Carl Virgian being the first administrator. The firstborn was Deanie Sue Mitchell, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jean Mitchell of Amsterdam. The hospital looks large from the ground level, but look at it from the air even before the addition. The new park and swimming pool in the upper part, and in 1961, the Butler Lions Club established an eye tissue bank at the hospital. Speaking of the pool and park, in 1966, a bond issue for the new park was quickly approved when Charlie and Myrtle Ott, managers of Russell's 5 and 10 cent store, donated $25,000 and the land south of the pool for a park. He was a former mayor of Butler. In 1969, the year the park was completed, the Butler Lions Club and Park Commission erected a memorial to Mr. and Mrs. Ott for their part in the park development. Pictured are, left to right, C.A. Berg, Cliff Lawrence, Johnny Underwood, Tom Berg, Francis Schallert, George Raymond Ray, Robert E. Miller, Bill Fisher, Jay Porter, Jack Combs, Othel Hodson, and Gary Schoengert. Kneeling left to right is Leroy Cook, Jerry Bryant, Eddie Herrman, Bob Steinbeck, G.J. Six, and Emmett Kling, who was the maker and erector of the stone. In 1978, the Park Commission recognized George Raymond Ray's work on the Park Commission. Shown seated is Mr. Ray. Standing left to right, Eddie Herrman, Robert E. Miller, Floyd Gaston, Cliff Lawrence, and Troy Burton. A far cry from the old sand greens west of the railroad, the new Butler Country Club is a well-designed area combining beautiful greens, lakes, and a very nice clubhouse. Back toward the square on Nursery and Main Streets is Butler Medical Lodge. Originally the Sunset View Corporation and local board, this nursing home is now owned by the Medical Lodge Corporation and managed by Lynn Blakeman. On South High Street, Willow Lane Nursing Home was the second such facility built in Butler and has expanded once since its first built. Manager is Melba Swope. Now let's get on Nursery Street and go east to Broadway and the fairgrounds and the ballparks. In 1934, the old Smith pasture south of Nursery Street at the south end of Broadway was chosen as the new CCC camp. That stands for Civilian Conservation Corps. In 1935, the rec hall and garage was added to the barracks, and in 1937, there were over 1,700 young men busy in county-wide CCC work. This camp was closed in 1938. Shown as one of the camp's basketball teams, but no names are available, and if you're wondering why they all have the same number, that was the camp's number. In 1947, the city of Butler appointed a committee to build softball and baseball fields at the OCCC camp location. Butler's always had baseball teams, but in the 60s, the Butler Comets began a wide schedule with a lot of good teams using talent from the county. Pictured is one of the early Butler Comets teams. The top inserts, Dale Smith and Larry Spud Wellston. The back row, George Wade, Lynn Nitchie, Roger Noe, Gary Smith, and Joe Rayburn. Lower end sets are Richard Harrison and Don Heckaden. Kneeling in the front row, Norman Appleberry, Brett Herman, Bat Boy, Eddie Herrman, manager, and Roger Reed. One of the last teams coached by Eddie Herrman was this 1983 American Legion team. On the back row is Pat Ray, Brett Herman, Darren Morrow, Darren Herman, and Coach Eddie Herrman. Front row, left to right, was Johnny Simons, Richard Riley, Marty Williams, Kenny Epperson, and David Franklin. In the 1998 Hucksters Day, people I trusted connived and named the baseball field for me. Shown with me are co-conspirators Darris McGoffin, president of the Chamber of Commerce, and Mayor Joe Fuller. Other co-conspirators were C.A. Moore, editor of the paper, and my wife Shirley. The last fair in this century, in the early days, the fair was held across Nursery Street, north of the lake. In the 1940s, the fair was held at the Benton Bridal Club on West Street. In 1973, the Bates County Fair was organized with Jerry King president, Mark Miller vice president, Harold Six treasurer, and James Barnhart secretary. The organization has continued, and as we close the century, here is the Fair Royalty of 1999. Fair Queen was Melissa Herring, daughter of Larry and Kara Herring. The Fair Princess was Lacey Merrifield, daughter of David and Marianne Merrifield. The grounds are also used by the Butler Rodeo and the Butler Saddle Club. Just east of the ballparks and fairgrounds, Billy D. Thornton of Arkansas built and operated the KMAM radio station. His brother Jerry, for years, handled selling the airtime. Later, the FM KMOE station was added, and the business is now known as FM 92 and managed by Bill's daughter, Melody. Giving the fishing news on KMAM radio in the mid-60s was Corncob Elmer Edstrom, an avid fisherman. His red station wagon not only gave the radio station publicity, but also Butler State Bank, who sponsored his show. That was tough work. This school on High Street was once the high school on the second floor and the grade school on the ground floor. In 1914, the high school classes moved to the new school at Pine and Havana. In 1939, the new elementary school was dedicated. The replica Statue of Liberty was erected by the Boy Scouts later. The new high school opened in 1914, and a gymnasium and home ec rooms were added in the late 20s, and we'll see more of this building later. Pictured here in 1931 is the first FFA agricultural class at Butler High. In the front row was Forrest Boland, Kenneth Van Fossen, Gerald Gilbert, Junior Dixon, Charles Grant, Junior Potter, Clifford McCoy, and Bob Frank Allen. In the middle row, Professor Lester Maddox, Roland Moreland, Herbert Taylor, Wallace Folk, Eugene Miller, Willard Steiner, George Morris, John Rogers, and Kenneth Rogers. In the back row was Floyd Borland, William Barbie, Willard Thomas, Earl Osborne, William Osborne, William McVeigh, Elmer Eccles, Harlan Allison, and Newland Eisen. Shown here is one of the school buses in the late 30s. West Black City Oil and Gas Company operated the buses for the school, and the fee was $1 a month. The house in the background is now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Paul Phillips. Of this 1925 Butler football team coached by Joe Deaton, 3 are identified. In the back row, second from the left, Bob Henry. Middle row first, Marvin Compton. And third in the second row was Herb Anderson. You may be able to identify others. In 1965, Joe Deaton of Fresno, California was reunited with some of the football players he coached at Butler High from 24 to 27. In the front row, left to right, is Lyle B. Warren, Coach Deaton, Herb Anderson, and Henry Wells. In the back row, left to right, is John Compton, Armand Skinny Boland, Farrell Hap Clark, Robert Henry, and Ralph Hooker Moore, Harold Cotton Smith, Marvin Compton, and Glenn Crowley. The Thomas Deaton Field was named for coaches Thomas and Joe Deaton. Here is the Butler High School Orchestra on the south steps, probably in the 40s. This is Butler High's girls basketball team in 52-53. Picture left to right, the front row, Barbara Wolf, Marilyn Davis, Tressie Wells, Jessie Miller, Shirley Smith, Shirley Deans, and in the back row, left to right, is Betty Lou Bradley, Joanne Hancock, Coach Bob Glenn, Judy Leach, and Janice Haston. In a game with Adrian in 1953, Smith scored 42 points and Jeanette Davis of the Adrian team scored 41, but Butler won 56-55. Did it again? This is the 1956 Butler High School concert band. Leland Miller was the director, and he's at rear left. The 1956 Butler High School basketball team were high scorers. Shown are Billy Kinney, Joe Harvey Beckham, Jerry Roberts, Doug Burris, Mac Brassfield, Warren Hanson, Bob Murphy, Robert I. Miller, Jim Gardner, Ron Gardner, and Coach Brewington. Then we have Jim Leach, Jim Adams, Gary Pyatt, Benny Warren, Everett Grant, Gary Hoover, Mike Poland, Larry Henry, and Larry Shaver, and Galen Lewis. The school board paid $15,000 for 15 acres on the northwest corner of Nursery and Fulton Streets. Here is the east side, or the front, of the new school. This is the high school complex from the air. To the right is the north. The school board at Thomas Deaton football field. Yes, the correct name is Thomas Deaton. That's the way it was dedicated. These 12 Butler Bear tracksters qualified for the state meet in Jefferson City in 1983. Front row, Mike Jones, Kirk Hanna, Pat Quick, Kim Welburn, Jeff White, and Pat Ray. In the back, left to right, is Andre Aquila, who is the foreign exchange student, Stephen Miller, Johnny Simons, Sean Moggins, Brett Herman, and Eric Smith. In the 90s, the alternative school was built northwest of the main high school complex. And what happened to the old high school building on Pine Street? Well, it belongs to the city of Butler, and the police department, city jail, and the fire department are in it. The committee to save our old high school has been labored hard and long and are getting the auditorium restaged and all fixed up. The Butler High School Alumni Association meets every year. In years past, there were three things certain for seniors: baccalaureate, graduation, and joining the alumna. In recent years, they don't seem to be interested in number three, but we oldsters still observe it. Pictured is the 50th reunion, the class of 1927, and I'm sure you can recognize some in this photo of May of '77. And here's the last graduating class from Butler High in the 20th century. This photo by J.B. Fleming is the Chastain Memorial Gate off H Highway to Oak Hill Cemetery. This is one of the older parts of the cemetery, which has, according to Ripley's, believe it or not, the smallest tombstone in the world. The cheese plant was built on East Mill Street in 1941. Farmers who couldn't make the grade A for Chapman Dairy sold to the cheese plant. As dairying became more exacting, the plant was closed. The city purchased the old cheese plant and remodeled it to house heavy equipment and trucks and to repair the city vehicles. In 1940, left to right, Floyd Hawkins, Frank Crouch, Bertie White, and George Raymond Ray organized the Brotherhood Quartet, and for several years they were in heavy demand near and far. In the early 1940s, this was the Douglas School in East Butler. Front row, left to right, Randolph Cooper Jr., Paul Hawkins, Edward Luther, Ted Sweets, Prince Ellis, Raymond Jacobs, Pat Burns Renfro, Earl Brown, Carl Brown, and Wallace Dobie Ray. Second row, left to right, Elnora Cooper Burton, Mildred Rippeteau Wright, Barbara Warren Render, Leonard Burton, John Willard, Margaret Harper Lewis, Freddie Rippeteau, and Benjamin Warren. In the third row, teacher Houston Ellis, Shirley Sweets Moses, Catherine Smith, Wesley Hawkins, and Jerry Hawkins. Briscoe Lodge number 54 was organized, and in this photo are, in the front, Hobart Sweets. Second row, left to right, is Robert Hawkins, Elliot Mickey Willard, and Willis Burton. In the third row, Jack Brown, and Troy Burton. In the back row, Earl Crouch, Glenn White, Jim Mack, George Raymond Ray, and Frank Crouch. In 1956, the Briscoe Lodge purchased the old Douglas School for their hall. The surrounding schoolyard was turned into a park and playground. Shown is the Allen Park marker stone showing the officers when the park was dedicated. This is the Jeff Van Vibber Family Medical Office on South Fulton Street at Atchison. East of Van Vibber's one block is the Butler Public Library. Originally located in the courthouse, it was moved to this location to a new building in 1977 on land donated by Mr. and Mrs. Melvin Rice. An addition to the public library was made possible by a monetary gift from Robert and Virginia Heinlein. Robert, a science fiction writer, was born in Butler. West of the square on Fort Scott Street is the Boy Scout Hall, built there where the old swimming pool used to be in the 30s and 40s. Troop 37 was organized by Charles Robertson, Bill Kane, and Stanley No, and Dr. C.W. Luter was very active in scout work also. We're now going to show the churches at the end of the century, and we start at the 4-lane 71 highway at Mill Street and the Kingdom's Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. At Mill Street and Sunrise Drive, we have the Berean Baptist Church. At 801 West Dakota is the Emmanuel Baptist Church. This was the old St. Patrick's Catholic Church north of the grade school. This is the current St. Patrick Church and School at 400 West Nursery. Here's St. Matthew's Lutheran Church on Atchison Street. On Nursery at South Delaware is the Church of the Nazarene. On South Main Street, south of Nursery, is the First Assembly of God Church. East of the library on South Main is the South Main Church of Christ. The Church of God Church is located on Mechanic Street at Oak Street. At 621 East Fort Scott, on the site of the old Franklin School, stands the Church of Christ. This is the Calvary Baptist Church on East Dakota Street. One of the older churches in Butler is the Mount Zion United Methodist Church on East Pine Street. This is the Brooks Chapel AME, also on East Pine. One of the newer congregations in Butler is the Butler Restoration Branch of the Church of Jesus Christ at 4 West Pine. One of Butler's older churches at Delaware and Pine is the First Christian Church. This was the first Baptist church built in 1917, considered to be one of the prettiest around. That same church burned just prior to Thanksgiving services in 1943. And this is what the First Baptist Church looks like in 1999. Another old congregation is the Butler Presbyterian Church at Pine and Fulton Street, and the white building at the left is the home of the disabled American veterans. Located at 205 North Fulton is the Church of Christ. This is the Messenger Pentecostal Church of God at Harrison at Maple Streets. This is the original reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and was located north of Chapman Dairy. This is today's RLDS Church at 409 West Dakota. This church has been around a long time, the Ohio Street United Methodist Church. This is the post office, built in 1918, and it continues today. In 1950, the U.S. Postal Service inaugurated the Highway Postal Bus from Kansas City to Carthage, with stops in morning and afternoon in between. The photo you see is at a ceremony, and it shows Mayor Charles Ott at the microphone. Postmaster R.D. Dode Holland is to the right. This is the post office crew in 1950. Left to right, front row, R.D. Holland, postmaster, Lloyd Brooks, C.A. Moore Sr., Buddy Lewis, and Elmer Campbell, assistant postmaster. Second row, John Mills, Charlie Robertson, Erland Campbell, Hooker Moore, and Arthur Hardinger. Back row, Nat Stubblefield, Leroy Beckham, Jack Rich, Joe Herndon, Herbert Taylor, Morris Walters, Buster Ramsey, and A.L. Rook. In 1956, Butler celebrated its centennial, and everyone joined in the festivities. The driving committee for the centennial was, seated left to right, Charlie Ott, Mrs. W.A. Kinney, and C.A. Moore Jr. In the back row was Melvin Rice and Martin Levy. Clifford Bruner was chosen to portray General Orlando Butler of Kentucky, for whom the city was named. This is the city office staff, Lula Wofford and Clothine Bartley. City officials for the centennial were, seated left to right, Clifford Clark, Elmer Sutton, Merle Tyner Mayer, A.E. McGuire, and Joe Gear. Standing left to right were Earl Woodall of the police department, Edward J. Murphy, the city attorney, Ross Williams, the city marshal, R.G. Hatton was on the council, A.B. Edgerton, the city judge, and E.E. Gammett was superintendent of utilities. These are the light plant employees celebrating. George Craig on the running board, and the others left to right are Orville Wheatley, Fred Nigley, Leonard Miller, and Earl Seeley. This is the volunteer fire department. Left to right is Leslie Doc Barrett, Clarence Dexter, Dreamy Rob, Chief Rodney Grimm, Fred Nigley, Don Edmonds, and at the rear is Walter Taylor and Orville Wheatley. These are the city maintenance crews. Left to right back row is Edward England, Harvey Pittman, C.C. Fullerton, and C.A. Potter, pardon me. The second row left to right was Miller Ferguson, Leo Freeburg, Sam Anderson, and Don Edmonds. In the front was Perry Hill, Kermit Stearns, and Dreamy Rob. The Butler Lions Club also got into the centennial mood. How many can you name? One of the entrants in one of the many parades for the centennial included Henry Wells and his oxen team. Also an entrant in the parades was Miss Josie Kersey, a familiar figure in Butler, with her 1926 Chevrolet touring car that she actually drove every day into the 60s. At the 1948 Butler High School Alumni Association meeting, former members of the Legionnaires Band and classmates entertained the grads. Left to right, C.A. Moore, Mel Stevens, Earl Anderson, Melvin Billington, Bob Noe, Ray Miller, and Eugene DeShields. In the 1950s, the Butler PTA put on a show where the men dressed as women and the women dressed as men. Here are three of the ladies, left to right, Bill Fisher, Bob Kinney, and Lester Kahn. Postal employee Lyle Norman founded the Lyle Norman Players and directed several shows and was the president of the group until his death in 1980. Lyle directed and assembled 4 shows. The last one in '79 was Christmas Fantasy, a dinner show at the high school. Do you recognize anyone? After Lyle's death, here are some scenes from shows we did. In the show We're in the Army Now, Private Giffen Simmons left to showing Sergeant Eddie Herrman and General Johnny Underwood how he unplugged a stool. Also watching are Harry McFerrin, Bill Curran, and Rusty Ross. In the show The Nifty Fifties, the crew was harmonizing. Left to right is Carol Russell, Linda Law, Johnny Underwood, Jack Armstrong, Janet Fonstock, Marva Armstrong, Lila Leinard, Edna Shaver, Kathy Law, Shirley Herman, Betty Roby, and Peggy Fuller. The boys in the cars are not identified. In 1985, Christmas at Irma's introduced to the public Celeste and Sybil Landfill, the garbage collectors. Showing are the girls played by Shirley Herman and Lila Leinard. Holding his nose at the table is Russ Stanley, and behind him and to the right is Dean Scott and Michael Robbins, wondering what they got into. The following year we presented Don't Fence Me In. Gibbon Simmons left is being told by Rusty Ross, third from the left, you're supposed to wear pants under your chaps. Well, Sheriff Jim Porter agrees. On looking Left to right is Pat Frederick, Karen Russell, Teresa Connor, Pam Simmons, Mitch Dodds, and Lisa Primo. In that same show, Grandpa, played by Farrell Atkins, spins some wild tale at the campfire. Left to right, Karen Russell, Rusty Ross, Teresa Connor, Pat Frederick, Carol Dodds, Mitzi Grainer, and Shirley Herman look on in awe. After 20 shows, it seemed that we were all busier, or had lost interest, or were just plain tired. Altogether, many organizations in Butler benefited from our shows. And two of my dear friends, Johnny and Pauline Underwood, cemented together the early shows. Johnny with his ad-libs, and Pauline and daughter Paula Schoengerd made the music fit the scripts. Carol Dodds and Sally Rives later conducted the music. Looking down North Main Street from the square, we see the 200 block of North Main. Shown in 1966 was Franklin's Maytag and the Harwick Chemicals, Beckham Herman Insurance, the Harold Caskey Law Office, and the Henshaw Dental Office, and Janie's Beauty Shop, and the Chamber of Commerce Office with apartments up above. On August the 28th, 1973, if you happen to be flying over Butler, this is what you saw. An overheated gas heater in the apartment over the Chamber Office supposedly started this fire. Gone are 208, 210, and 212 North Main, and it was never built back. Built by Farmer Oaks for his Coca-Cola bottling plant, it's been the B&L Glass, and now it is the Sign Art Studio, Dan Brewer, manager. Today we see Sandy's Herb Shop and the Henshaw Building and J.B. Winters Real Estate on the right, on the left, and on the right and to the center is Smith's Shoe Shop, Charlie Scrogham's Barber Shop. The big brown building was Tom McGuire's, and he has his real estate office on the second floor, and the first floor is the Friendship Day Care and Sharon Everett's Inn of Sheer Beauty. Red and yellow building is storage. The two-story red building with the awning was the fire station for years, and then a feed store, and now storage. And the blue building, once Henry Auto and Henry Radio, is, well, I'll tell you more about that later on. Marvin Compton opened this prototype Skelly service station in 1942. Marvin is at the windshield. This was a standard for a Skelly station in 17 states. Some years later, Harold Alexander operated the same station, taken over from Lester Blizzard. Shown left to right, Harold Alexander, Ralph Jennings, and Danny Fonstock. This is the same location, and George Vowles has the Western Communications office there, and has been remodeled vastly. On the northeast corner of Main and Pine is the Body Works, operated by Shirley Hicks. There's been many other occupants, including Barney Zellmer Real Estate over the years. The building to the right is William Campbell's Earth Stove business. At the left has been Henry Oldsmobile, Henry Dodge, and even Henry Nash, but worldwide it's been Henry Radio and shortwave radio equipment, now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Doug Thompson. To the right, once owned by Cumberland Motor Company, was later owned by Jackson Brothers of Kansas City. Then Don Eads and Wendell Park bought them out and moved it to where Hardee's is now. To the left was Henry Kaiser's Cafe and Tavern. Mr. Cubbin, besides displaying the world's largest tire in 1931, also sold Ford tractors, and is now Robertson Storage. At Chestnut and Lion Streets is the cold storage area. The ice plant in the north end of this building is now Berry Cold Ice, formerly Kammerer Ice and formerly Ingram Ice. The building to the right is Melvin Ingram's heating and cooling business. On the south end of this building was C.H. Lepton's Ice Cream Factory, and later became Maury Williams and Junior Thompson's Locker Plant. Then Howard Sherman had a meat processing company there, and now it's Randolph's Book Binding Plant, owned and operated by Randy and Edith Finkel. Just northeast of the light plant is John Miller's Barbecue Place. From the East Dakota Street was Stanley Gray Motors. He and Wilbur Hastings bought this in 1943, then they split, and Stanley Gray ran it for several years. Stanley Gray sold to Dwight Bittner and Bud Stark in 1969, and in 74 the fire destroyed this building, and an employee, Loren Cunningham, lost his life in the blaze. The building at the right was one time L.C. Steiner's Minneapolis Moline Farm Equipment, and then later was Wallace and James Burton's garage. And here it is today, but it's Troy Miner's Auto Repair, and across the street to the west, which is to your right, is Arnold and Sherry Hanna's Subs and Ice Cream Shop, where Burton's garage used to be. Moving southeast to the corner of Fort Scott and Mechanic Streets is the old Chapman Dairy Receiving Plant, built in 1928. The Chapman Dairy location is now the Sheldon Workshop, the building at the right, and the big white building on the left is the Bates County Jail, opened in 1941. Dwayne Deal is the present sheriff. This is the old jail of Bates County, and when it was replaced by the new jail in 41, this building stood idle until the Bates County Historical Society was organized and the county deeded the jail building to the society for a museum. Reva Stubblefield was the first curator and Wilbur Haston the first vice president. They are shown on the left. At the corner of South Main and Fort Scott, the building at the right is the Associated Natural Gas Company. Marty Snow is the manager. Across the street to your left is Randy Rader's Shelter Insurance Building, and it was built originally for the Farmers Mutual Lightning Insurance Company, which later was renamed Bates County Mutual. North on the east side is a car wash, which is not shown, but then there's the Uptown Laundry, owned and operated by Stacy Hutton, and then Rick Plunkett's Transmission Shop and the Bates County Sign and Banner Company. Over the years, there have been many car dealers and auto repairers along this area, and the latest was Maurice Dugan's Dodge dealership, and he also built the laundry and the car wash. On South Delaware, just off the square, shown is Joy Craft's Hair Care Salon. Several years ago, this was Arthur Schultz's Butler Music House, later Jim Fonstock's Music and TV Repair Store, and next door is Cantrell's C.L. Vac and Sew Store. Until recently, this was the Chamber of Commerce office building. Before the Chamber of Commerce moved in, this was Doc Garrett's Auto Repair, Nat Stubblefield's Produce, and Fred Eads' Garage. And no, Fred hadn't worked on this one yet. That was Don Eads' father. Shown is Casey's number 2, just southwest of the square. Looking on the south side of Dakota Street, west of the square, shown is Don Eads Dodge, formerly Melvin Rice Truck and Tractor Company. West of Don Eads was Marion Arnold's Feed Store and Arnold's Bottling Works, where he bottled Orange Crush and Chocolate Crush and Sterling Beer after the Prohibition went out. In the 60s, the left, which is leased Arnold's Feed Store, and 1960 Arnold sold the mill to George Ross. And the west building in the 30s was Buck Henson's Produce and Ice, prior to the bottling works being put there. Now, in 1999, on the left is Country Comfort Furniture, Steve Dixon owner. Then the white building is West Compton's Bates County Telecom. West of that is Danny Robinson's American Family Insurance Office, and at the end is Franklin and Company Accounting and Tax Firm. This old gas station was on the southwest corner of Dakota and Havana Streets, and it was run by Roy Wheatley in 1938. In 1951, Charlie Wines built a new building and moved his grocery and dry goods store there, and also had Hargrave's Furniture and the SAS office building in the West End. In 1956, fire burned out Wines store and damaged the others. Now the only building left on that block is the Lodge Hall, Rebecca's and the Oddfellows, as Vitazine burned out, then moved to new 71 and 52 location. On the northeast corner of Havana Street in West Dakota, where Butler Monument has their stone storage, was a Deep Rock service station run by Claude and Pearlie Warren in 1933. Rice Truck and Tractor later used it as a storage lot for their implements. This photo taken in 1972 shows the building on West Dakota Street on the north side. The one-story building had several occupants. One time Charles Temure and C.A. Moore had the Bates County Headliner newspaper there. And the two-story building has always been a cleaning or laundry business. And it was a Troy Steam Laundry, and then later Anderson's Laundry. And in the 80s, was absorbed by Gerald Petty, who had purchased Marshall's Cleaners on the west side of the square. Here's today's version of that last building we saw. Left to right, the Country Cleaners, H&R Block Tax Office, and Kenny Fullerton's Mower and Engine Service. Here's West Ohio Street off the square. This photo is around 1972, and it shows on the left the rear of the Fisk building, then the big white building in the middle was Elmer Morton's Western Auto Store. To the west, that building was a cafe that had had many different owners over the years. Then beauty shops and the Kling Apartments and George Crinn Insurance and West Denton Real Estate, and of course the Ohio Street Methodist Church. This is basically the same location with a different view during a parade in the 30s. We see on the left the Crystal Sandwich Shop, and then the Crystal Hotel, which in 32 was demolished by fire and later rebuilt, and the Kling family opened apartments after they purchased it. Today we show the Don and Ruby Stoughtonmeister Corner Hardware Store, then Helen Kling's Porch and Patio Shop, and to the right of that is Joyce York's Beauty Shop, then the Kling Apartments and Jim Dugan's FRMS Insurance Office. Just around the corner south is the Butler Monument Company, now operated by Paul and Melissa Phillips, she being the granddaughter of Emmett Kling Sr., the founder, who had moved from Nevada to Butler in 1925. Here's a long ago Kling Monument crew at some cemetery in Bates County. On the corner of Fulton and Ohio Street, in 1931, Claude O'Neill was the manager of the new Shell station. In 1935, it was remodeled as the building you see, and Charlie and Bessie Hendrickson moved from owning a store in Ballard to run this station. In 1940, Roy and Lois Hendrickson, also of Ballard, took over this station and changed it to Texaco. They later opened the Firestone store on the west side of the square where Leneve's is located. In the late 40s, Charles E. Smith operated this station and pictured as his brother Donald Smith, who was manning the pumps. In 1948, Bill and Barbara Birch bought the station from Wes Miller. In the 60s, Bill's Furnace Shop was opened in the location where you just saw those service stations by Bill and Louise Fisher. Pictured are, left to right, Arnold Hanna, Dean Smith, Gene Lockard, Lester Mills, Ivan Dodds, and Billy Fisher. Here's the modern Bates County heating and cooling plant on the right. Gene Lockard is now the owner, and to the left is the American Legion Hall that opened in 1934 after being constructed by the WPA and the CCC organizations. West of the post office, there always seemed to have been a lot of service stations. This photo taken in the early 30s shows Claude Warren at his Standard Station. Names of other owners have been Art Headley Jr., Orville Jackson, Frank Long, Claude Billingsley, and others that I don't have info on. On the location of those service stations is now Shirley Maxwell's Beauty Salon on the right and Geneva Huff's Beauty Salon on the left. West of the beauty salons is a building that once housed Jack Zellmer's Sears store when he moved it from the square. Today it's a law office of Richard Keeler. The Body Harmony never opened. This is in the Chestnut and Havana Street area. Several years ago, Dr. Carter Luter and Dr. Douglas Ronald built the right side of this building, moving from the north end of the west side of the square. Today, the present owner is Curtis Long and Associates. In the middle part, Dr. Stanley Noe moved over from the same building as Luter had been in. His son John Noe now has Dr. David and Susan Miller in his office with him. And to the left is the dental office of Dr. William Mollenhauer, formerly Robert Woods and Art Peters dental offices, and Ralph Smith law office. Just north of the Inn building once was the Methodist Church South. Later the telephone company was built when the two Methodist churches merged into the Ohio Street Church. On the left is now a switchboard operation and service office for the telephone company, while the white building to the right was the Osage Pecan plant. Now is Paul and Melissa Phillips' Highlights store. For years, West Black had this service station on Chestnut Street behind what is now Bank of America on the square. Pictured in 1930, left to right, were Elmer Smullins, Marshall Smith, John Shantz, who was a tank man, Tom Mefford, Wes Black the owner, and O.B. Ray. Later it became a mobile station with Tom Mefford as the manager and has been owned by the bank for several years as storage. Let's take a look at the corners of the square, beginning with the northeast corner. For years it was the Heinlein building, and later owned by Norton Seeliger, who had a furniture store on the north side and Western Auto Store on the south side, which he later sold to Ed Linville, and then Elmer Morton bought it from him. In 1972, it burned to the ground. Jennings Corporation purchased this lot and built the Furniture House building. Harold Jennings operates it with daughter Terry. Notice the original brick street put down in 1910. While we're at Ohio Street, just east of the square is Butler City Hall. Besides offices, it has a large auditorium in the rear. City Hall was originally on the west side of the Butler Square, and I'll show you later where. In the City Hall parking lot to the south was the Logan Moore lumber yard. Several years ago it burned. For years this was the water tower or standpipe on Maple and Mill. For years it was used, but in the late 40s began springing leaks regularly and was torn down in the 60s when the new one at City Hall was erected. And there was a small trailer court on Maple before permanent housing was constructed. Now to the southeast corner of the square, for years known as the Cease Building, and has had a lot of occupants. This photo was taken in 1935, just after A.C. Jennings and his family had moved to this location and opened a grocery store. They lived up above it before moving to the southwest corner in 41. In the 1920s, the Butler High School basketball team played their games here. Some later occupants were Jim and Donna Catherine's Sears store, and then Jack and Patsy Zilmer had their Sears store there, and the Senior Citizen site was there for several years. The band was on the square for the Old Settlers Parade. And here is the southeast corner today. At the right on the corner of this photo is Juanita Crosland's consignment shop, and on the left is West Central of Missouri, and on the left of that is a computer shop operated by Joey Plunkett, who we understand is moving to the west side of the square. Now to the southwest corner of the square. For years, many a person paid a dime to see a picture show at Fisk Theater shown. Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Fisk had a background of theater. Charlie Fisk Jr. had a band at Missouri University and then had one of the best bands in the nation in the early 40s, and he could play 3 trumpets at the same time. This is one of Charlie Fisk Jr.'s orchestras, always nattily attired. Charlie's at the microphone and his wife, the singer, was seated. He played in many ballrooms and hotels in the nation. Charlie Fisk Sr. in the late 30s remodeled his movie theater, making it more attractive. Here's a monthly program for Fisk Theater in July of 41. I like the Saturday afternoon shoot-em-ups the best. January 4th, 1951, an era passed. Even though Rice Truck and Tractor Company suffered some damage, Fisk Theater burned to the ground. Fires always draw a crowd, but if it's something large like the Jennings Building and Fisk Theater, you really get a crowd. This fire truck was parked on the west side of Wolf's Hardware, now Randy's Cafe. Everyone in the upstairs apartments were safe, but all else went up in flames. The Jennings family, who had moved from Butler to Virginia to the southeast corner of the square, moved to the southwest corner of the square in 1941 and opened the grocery store. This photo is shown, and we have Molly, George, Orville, Arthur C., Floyd Brannick, Jim Huffman, and in front is Wilbur and a Mr. Whalen. Harold and Alice were not present. Out of adversity, this is an all-new building taking up the whole block. So 2 of the newest buildings on the square are owned by the Jennings Corporation, the northeast corner and the southwest corner. Let's get on the square. Here is a photo by Robertson Aviation. It's not dated, but at the top of the picture is Logan Moore Lumber Company, and at the lower right where Jennings has rebuilt, but only the east half. Must be around 1952. In 1971, the city let me climb the water tower at City Hall. I took this photo of the square. The city employee who was assigned to watch me in case I got in trouble himself got sick watching me and had to go inside and lay down. Let's begin at the east end, the south side of the square. Here's a photo taken in 1972. Pete and Betty Province had the Sears store. Then there was a tax office. Smith's Shoe Shop was next, and in the white building, James Ware. Next to the white building was James Ware's paint store. Here's a newer photo, probably in the early 80s. Note the changes. Still more changes, same location, but in 1999. This is the south side of the square beginning at the east end. First we see on the right Kelly and K. Wells Printmaster, and the Butler State Bank started there in 1945. Next is Ed Yoder's State Farm Insurance, formerly Daniels Plumbing, and next is Caulfelt Land Title Company, once was Jim Ramsey's jewelry store. And to the right, James Baldwin's Professional Bookkeeping, has the Chamber of Commerce office there, as well as Brookside office, and Carol Ann Winbridge New York Life was once Smith's Shoe Shop, and later Beckham Herrman Insurance Office. At left is Wick's TV showroom. One time was the Butler Times newspaper office and Beckham's men's clothes. Then the center is Aardvark and Wick's TV and Appliance, both owned by Cheryl Wicks Compton. At one time was Gamble Store. To the right, Harry Wells Town Square Hardware, formerly Reps Hardware, and earlier in the century was Wolf Hardware. On the left for years was Dixon Furniture Store, later J.B. Fleming's Photo Studio. Now it's Kaiser Nordike Law Office. The white building has been a second-hand store, a pool hall owned by Carl Graham and later J.L. Eckert, and now it's the D&J Pet Store. On the left we have Gary and Pat Evans Flowers and More Store. It's been a feed store, Allier Fabric Shop, like Johnson Grocery Store and Josh Beach Jewelry. At right is a Southside Barber Shop, a century old, Lowell Logan, owner and operator now. Creeping along we have the expanded Southside Cafe owned by Mr. and Mrs. Randy Weiss. The building at the left was for years a cafe. Millie Boswell was the one who had the last operation there. And the right building has been Wolf Hardware, Carpenter Hardware, and Corner Hardware, and it's now all the Southside Cafe. Before all the Butler banks bit the dust in the early 30s, the People's Bank at the north end of the west side of the square had an annual Children's Day. This is part of the crowd on one of those days, and this is now the Hatton location. At the north end of the west side of the square is the professional building. Doctors Luter and Woolridge and Ronald were all in the first building. Dr. Hugh and Stanley Noe were in the rear of the building, as well as lawyer Robert Spurrier. Next is the Fisk building. City Hall was in this at one time, and in 1940 it exploded, but no one was injured. The Scully Land Company had its offices upstairs. Next to the left is the Home Cafe, which later became the May Store. Ella Bryan managed it for years. So let's get on with today's west side. To the right is Dr. Robert L. and Robert G. Hatton's chiropractic offices, and a few years ago the upper story was removed. In the Fisk building is Bill Kiltron's sports shop. It was at one time Hayden's Ready Wear, Wine's Ladies to Wear, and then Dolores Fry had Dolores's Ladies to Wear with her daughter Pam Wimborne. Moving right along to the south of those former buildings, we find the orthodontics office of Bunswick and Moore. It was May's variety store for years. In the center is the Cascade Law Office, Annex and Meeting Room, formerly the Crabtree Grocery, Stevenson's Art Store, Potasco, and Rosemary Greener's Fabric Shop. To the left is Ever Bloomin' Things, Mrs. Charles Rush, owner. And for years, Joe Pratt's shoe store was there, then Rivers, then Davison's Shoes. In the 20s, the People's Grocery and the Rio Value store burned out. They rebuilt, and the Lonsinger building Lonsingers ran the Rio Value store for a long time. Mattingly's moved in 1960, and then they later moved to the north side of the square, then as Matco to Highway 52 West. The previous photo was before the Marvin Booth LaFon Crummett drugstore moved from the east side of the square. Later, Jim Shade and Steve Ruthman opened Butler Pharmacy and still operate it. In 1978, Mr. and Mrs. Romulus Pitts and sons Randy and Steve of Belton bought the Missouri Farm Loan Company from Frank E. Cox. On the right is Chuck Polite's Bates County-wide abstract and title office. It had been Marshall's Cleaners at one time. In the center is Kit's Gems and Jewelry Store. Was a barber shop, a beauty shop, and No's Drug Store previously. On the left is the law office of Harold L. Caskey and Deborah A. Hopkins. It was a restaurant for years. Rudy Swander had it in the 40s and 50s and fed a lot of Butler High School students at noon. This is a view of the south end of the west side of the square in the 70s. Country Squire and Leneves show up real well. All of the 3/4 part of the right part of this photograph is Don Leneves' TV and appliance store. In the early 40s, Roy and Lois Hendrickson ran a Firestone store here. The building to the left, the south end of the west side of the square, was Marie's A to Z, and now Plunkett's computer shop is going in. On the northwest corner of the square is the imposing Inn Hotel building. Built at the turn of the century, besides lodgings, there were barber shops, insurance offices, drugstores, pool halls, restaurants, beauty shops, jewelry shops, and Smith's Shoe Repair, as well as Smith Bookstore, Robertson's Office Supply, and the Farm Bureau office in this building. And here's one of the buses that stopped at the Crown Coach office in the hotel. It was a 25-passenger, 4-cylinder bus. Now here's an up-to-date photo of the Inn Hotel, now owned by Frosty Tione and Tione Truck Lines with offices on the upper floors. There are also a few apartments in the building. And off the lobby, Corey Lanyon Dental Office and John G. Daniels has a CPA office. The lobby had been a deli restaurant since '79 when Tom and Sally Berg began the venture, but it has been closed. For years, there was a trendy restaurant and bar in the basement. On the east side are 2 beauty shops. Here It Is with Teresa Gillespie and The Beauty Box with Norma Jean Jennings. And on the corner is Edward Jones Investment Company managed by Carl Simpson. During the Second World War, Mrs. W.H. Henry and daughter Mary Jane operated a crystal grinding plant for walkie-talkies for the government downstairs in the Missouri State Bank building. This photo taken by Valentech Studio in the early 50s, and it shows next to the bank was the Walton Loan and Real Estate Office, then came H.L. No's Drugstore, then Tom Vance Clothing, the N.P. Grocery Store, Russell's 5 and 10 cent store, the Kroger Grocery, Bates County Democrat newspaper, the Toll Drug Store, and the J.C. Penney store. In 1932, Stanley and Leslie No bought the Wolf Reinhardt drugstore on the north side of the square, and H.L. No moved his jewelry store from the west side. In 1940, No's building burned, and the shop to the east and west were both damaged, but slightly. Rebuilt after the fire, No's drugstore was the after-school hangout for teenagers. Going back to the Butler State Bank, this is the bank staff in the late 50s or 60s. The Babcocks, GE, and CW had purchased the bank from Charles Hayward, who had founded the bank in the 40s. Pictured are, front left to right, Clara Gable, Judy Colburn, Nancy Adkins, and Patty Hurt. Back left to right, C.W. Babcock, A.B. Schoengert, Karen Gardner. Hidden are Bill Bradley and Don Hayward, and then Shirley Herman, and partially hidden is Doris Krupp, and then Charlotte Mann. One note, when the bank first opened on the north side, Opal Rood had a remnant shop in the rear. She sold to Alice Gear and Cleta York, and Chuck Temure had his shopper office also there. This is the north side of the square from the east end, when it was the J.C. Penney's, Charlie Mobley was the manager, then Merton Eggman Direct Hall, Bates County Democrat newspaper, then Edgar Lee Robertson's 2 buildings, and the Mattingly store, and then 2 other buildings and the bank. After all that, let's get to the present. First, it was the Butler State Bank, then the Charter Bank, and Boatman's, and Nations Bank, and now it's the Bank of America. And to the right is J. Roger Irwin's law office. On the left, we have Steve Craig Miles' LPL Financial Office, once was No's drugstore location. At the right is Hallmark Cards, managed by Teresa Gilliam. It was once Tom Vance Clothes and Lawrence Beckham's Clothes, men's clothes. This is the second edition shop owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Ron Dunlap. Used to be the A&P store, then Jerry's Variety and Mattingly's. Once Charlie Ott's Russell's 5 and 10 cent store and the Kroger grocery, now are all Robertson's Office Supply, owned and operated by Edgar Lee Robertson and managed by Leroy Cook. On the left for several years was the Bates County Democrat newspaper office. Later, Dr. Robert E. Beach had his eye, ear, and nose office there, and now it's Len Bart's Photography and wife Kenna's Custom Frames. And on the right in the 20s was the home of the radio station WNAR, We Never Are Ready, in Rhodes Drugstore. Later, Mr. and Mrs. George Tull managed Lane's Drugstore, then bought it themselves. Then they sold to Merton and Opal Eggman, who later sold to the present owners, Phil and Margaret Hess. Built in the 1880s by Captain Hanna and Thomas Shaw, this was a multi-purpose building. On the top floor was the dance hall and lodge halls. Second floor was the Palace Hotel, later offices, and the ground floor has been stores like the American Clothing House, Byram's, J.C. Penney, later Joe Wick's Antiques Emporium, and now the Bent Bar Fitness Center and Video Rental, managed by Carolyn Phelps. The building is owned by Jim and Donna Catron. On the east side, at the north end, rebuilt entirely in 1921, the Farmers Bank was a very impressive building, but later it went under as well as the other banks during the Depression. In 1934, the First National Bank opened and for several years was the only bank operating in Butler. Shown at the right is the men's department of Levy's store. In the mid-40s, the bank staff was Betty Sims Roby, who spent 50 years in this location, Gus Kienberger, the owner, Elise Steiner Bolwig, Iris Pyle Hoffman, Georgiana Paulman Smith, and Harris H. Lyle. This bank is now the uptown branch of the BC National. Bill Hart, Butler radio and TV repairman for years, once said, "Levy's is older than dirt." Well, maybe not quite that old, but Samuel Levy came to Butler and in 1876 opened a clothing store in the middle building. Later, coming from Germany, were nephew Paul B. Levy, nephew Julius Levy, Ludwig Becker, Martin Levy, Reggie Becker Harwick, and most of whom have been affiliated with the Levy store over the years. In 1936, Butler attorney Elmer Silvers wrote Paul Levy a letter in which he penned, and I quote, "Levy's has become an institution. It is not a private business house, it is a community asset. It is as a business should be, a benefit to all within its influences," unquote. On the left is a Lighthouse Christian bookstore operated by Barbara Friedley, Barbara Lawrence, and Diane McGuire. This building has been a cafe and bakery 2 or 3 times. Remember the Rottenhouses and Wheeler bakeries. And right in the middle east side of the square is the H&R Locks, owned and operated by Susan Hellwig and Sally Rives. In 1939, Goldie Long moved her beauty shop from the west side to this location. And in 1955, Annette Davis and Grace Hoots bought out Goldie's. Bill Hoots, husband of Grace, redecorated the restroom, and people would come in just to see the restroom because of Bill's artwork on the walls. It was something to behold. Bill Hoots, who we just mentioned, was one of Butler's unique characters, as good artist as you could find. Pictured are a couple of envelopes he mailed from the South Pacific during his Navy tour in 1943. and his political card there, no, he didn't win. But as a city councilman, he could deflate a pompous Kansas City engineer or salesman in a minute. He was truly one of a kind, and he was a sign painter by trade. On the left is the former Butler Building and Loan Association building operated by Homer Duval. The building and loan was sold to First State Savings and is now Diane D. Thomas's law office. And the center building at one time was the Ludwig's Drugstore. Then Marvin and LaFawn Booth bought it, and it ended up on the west side of the square as Butler Pharmacy. In the 70s, Elwin Spears operated a Ward's catalog store here, and Harold Granger took it over in 1973. And Jay Porter has had a successful chiropractic business here for several years. To the right is the Cook Insurance office, successors to Crin Insurance and Crin Cook Insurance. Charles Rush is the owner-manager. Once occupied by Edward Murphy, attorney, and Dr. Robert E. Beach, eye, ear, and throat specialist. This is the News Express newspaper, Exchanger advertising paper, an expert print shop owned and operated by Jim and Carol Peters. C.A. Moore, a veteran newspaper man, is editor of the Express. This building formerly was the Missouri Western Gas Company for several years. Next is the Bates County Farm Bureau office, which was moved in '74 from the Inn Hotel building. R.J. Billington had a hardware store there for several years. This building also had a bowling alley previous to that. To the right on the corner is the law office of John Persley. For many years, A.E. McGuire and Sons, Elmo and Bill, operated a grocery store here. And on the second floor of these three buildings you've just seen is a large former dance hall and meeting hall. Every year in August or September, a phenomenon hits Butler. Hundreds of people converge to the annual reunion of the Bates County Old Settlers Association. This picture shows some of the 1939 crowd. Herbert Weemont is the MC trying to evoke a good, clear hog call from Mrs. Ray Sturgeon. And by the way, the two ladies on either side were contestants in the finger tasting contest. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, the Old Settlers crowd could always count on a song from Bertie White, left, and a fiddle tune from Buck Jones on the right. And in the last few years, it's been held in the City Hall. In 1982, Howard Sherman, owner-operator of the Locker plant on Lion Street, asked, "Why can't we have a Huckster's Day?" After explaining to the officials what was entailed, Butler did it that very year. In this photo taken by C.A. Moore, we see the corn shucking contest. Fredlin Bach to the right won the $25 first prize. In 1973, Missouri Governor Kit Bond, now one of our U.S. senators, was a special guest at the annual Chamber of Commerce banquet in a crowded dinner meeting at the Butler High School gymnasium. In this photo, we find Bond and Mrs. Melvin Rice conversing. Speaking of the Chamber of Commerce, beginning in 1973, Citizen of the Year awards were given, later changed to Community Service Awards, and then there were some Sam Walton Leadership Awards also. One of the most satisfying for me was the night that I give the Citizen of the Year award to my good pal, and a surprise pal, by the way, C.A. Moore. But doggone him, he's played a couple on me too, and this was one photograph he couldn't take. On the northwest corner of the courthouse lawn is a doughboy statue dedicated to the First War veterans. After all, in 1927, how could the committee know there would be other wars? This is the Bates County Courthouse as we leave this century. You've seen the courthouse and you've probably looked at the clock and you've listened to it strike. This photo shows Fred Nigley, who for years kept that clock going in the courthouse dome. Len Bartz is now the clock custodian. I remember Charlie Ott. He always gave me a small sack of candy when my mom shopped at Russell's store on the north side of the square. He and Myrtle, more than anyone else, were probably more responsible for our parks, giving them money and land. He was a mayor, and when he decided not to run again, he gave a retiring dinner for those of the city government. In 1950, it read like a who's who. This was taken at the Colonial Banquet Room in the Inn building, and seated are, left to right, Lyle Norman, W.D. Mann, Merle Tyner, Jim Nisley, Mayor Ott, Walter Taylor, Ray Lockhart, Hallie Turpin, and Walter Foster. Now going back for those that are standing left to right, Charlie Stover, W.O. Jackson, Ray Blankenship, U.E. Norris, George Tull, Farmer Oakes, John Shepard, Bill Kane, Gene Radford, and Willard Love. Charlie and Myrtle Ott gave more to Butler than Butler had given them. At the gathering of the 1997 100th anniversary of the Bates County Old Settlers Association reunion, Len Bartz, photographer, took this picture. I'm in there. Are you?